Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and it's Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. So I've got some downtime since there's no live classes in the academy today. My kids are over their grandparents' house, so it's nice and quiet here on the farm. I'd like to talk today about why Catholic parenting and education seems to be so difficult. Why does it seem to be so difficult? We can go back into history and read stories about families and children growing up in society. We can read stories about children that seem to be disciplined. They seem to be humble and under control and so on. And then we come to modern times in American culture, and it just feels like we've got to sacrifice everything and push ourselves to the brink of total collapse just to get kids through basic education. And if you don't know history, or if you just don't reflect on these things or search them out, you'll start to feel like you're going crazy, or that there's something really wrong with you. And the truth is that we live in historically unprecedented circumstances. We live in circumstances that Christians never had to deal with throughout history. And the implications of these things are very significant. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about some of these things. First of all, we live in a society that's democratic, and that is a source of just endless chaos and distraction and obnoxious behavior, because everyone walks around thinking that they have just as much to say, or that they're just as smart on any subject and just as important on any issue as anyone else. That was never done in history, never, until democratic society was invented by a bunch of crazy people. In ancient society, there were kings, and the king was the law, and the king appointed the leaders of every different aspect of life in the state. The king commanded everyone, and everyone was required to obey the king. And if you didn't obey the king, you got punished. And every kid that you read about who grew up in medieval society or grew up in the ancient world, those kids grew up under authority, or even their parents were under authority. And the kings, of course, commanded children to obey their parents just as God does. And if kids didn't obey their parents, they got punished by the government. In the Old Testament, in Israel, if a son was disobedient, the father could bring his disobedient son to the judges, present the son to the judges, and in the law of the Old Testament, that son for disobedience could be put to death. In ancient Rome, the father had authority over his son, and he himself could really do whatever he wanted to him. He had the power of life and death over his son. It's only in this modern crazy world, and I'm not saying that those things are necessary or even good, but what I'm saying is that we can't compare our society and past society. They're very different circumstances. In our society, children are encouraged to disobey their parents. Their parents are told that they're not allowed to tell their children what to do. You've got organizations marketing children, reaching to children to advertise to them, to lead them to make decisions with no reference to their parents at all. Historically, generally speaking, obviously there were corrupt people who did bad things, but generally speaking, the challenges that we face as parents in America are unprecedented. And we feel that every day. We feel like we're going crazy because this is crazy. And it's nearly impossible. It's an evil society that doesn't respect social order. And we feel the brunt of that as parents. Now, unfortunately, many parents got into parenting and chose to get married and so forth because they imagined that they were going to just reproduce some old family life, and they're learning the hard way that it doesn't work like that. It's very difficult to maintain order, very difficult to even have marriages stay together nowadays, because there's just no respect for any social order. The people say, look, we make the Constitution, we make the laws, we decide what's right and wrong, and that can change. And if mom don't like it, that's okay. She's old, it doesn't matter. She has one vote, I have one vote. That's how inferiors in modern society think. Historically, it didn't work like that. So we do have a significant challenge to face. Another issue that no one talks about, which is really ridiculous, is slavery. Most of the things that we read about in ancient times or even medieval times just take for granted the existence of slaves and domestic servants. We read stories about women with children, and this woman had 9 children and they lived like this and they did this and they spent their days studying and blah, blah, blah. How beautiful. Everyone dressed beautifully, the house decorated ornately, everything lovely. Fathers spent their time reading and discussing politics and religion and philosophy, everything so noble and beautiful. But we ignore the whole system of servants that took care of all of the servile labor, all of the mechanical labor, all the manual tasks that needed to be done. They were all being done by servants. Well, those servants today don't exist, and they've been replaced either by technology in the form of appliances and software and apps and devices, or I should also say just any machines in general, or they've been replaced by paid workers. And again, we live in a society that's pushing for minimum wage workers, the most unskilled and uneducated workers, to expect pay close to $15 an hour. And that's just insanity. Basic jobs in town, working as a cashier at a Walgreens pharmacy. I'm not talking about being a pharmacist. I'm talking about working at the cashier in the store area. They're getting hired at $13 an hour as teenagers. So the idea that you're going to hire some household help or some gardening help is just becoming ridiculous. And so people just aren't doing these things anymore. No one can afford to have nice gardens. No one can afford to have things that people could formerly have, because a 16-year-old kid who's willing to work is going to expect to be paid $13 an hour to help. And there's just no sustainable activity that people can afford to pay that kind of wage for basic manual help. So to do these things, you've got mom out in the garden, you've got dad out turning over the soil and building a garden. Well, that's not what mom and dad did. I mean, I know if you're sitting around watching Little House on the Prairie, which is a TV show, remember, and secondly is covering the events of another historically extraordinary time, right? The settling of Western America. Again, you're comparing apples with oranges. Yeah, Pa Wilder who I personally can't stand his character. If you step back and just, watch the show without getting wrapped up in it, because my kids have always watched it. You step back and watch it, and he's always wrapped up in some kind of trouble. The house is on fire, the barn is burning down, they're being attacked by Indians, the wheat harvest is lost, there's a terrible storm, he does something terrible at work, causes someone to get injured. It's like every episode is about how terrible this man's life is, and somehow people watch it and walk away and say, man, to be able to live like that. I don't agree. I have no interest in living like Charles Ingalls. And if you keep watching the series, it ends up being one of the most miserable, depressing stories I think that I've ever seen. One daughter ends up blind. Their family's miserable. They eventually have to leave the prairie and go live in some miserable town in Minnesota and work at like a hotel restaurant. The story is terrible, and yet it's talked about as it's some kind of admirable life. It's just a unique historical period where people were moving out into the West and they had to claim land and settle things, and most of their efforts ended in failure. And meanwhile, we're talking about like the 1840s and 50s. We're not talking about, ancient times. The story of the Ingalls family is like 1850s. Meanwhile, while they're struggling to try to, make bread in, where were they, Minnesota? While they're trying to make bread and not have their children killed by wolves, meanwhile, you've got Victorian England in full operation at the same time. So it's just, historically, it's ridiculous. And there are Christians sitting around watching the first few episodes of Little House, thinking how nice it would be to go play in a field rather than work in the city. Well, as you'll learn through experience in life, and as you'll learn if you just keep watching the series, it doesn't end very well. So you might want to jump ahead a few episodes and start watching the later series. But historically, as I was saying, men and women didn't do these things. Servants did these things. Servants who had no other work that they could do, no other way to make a living, no other way to live a sustainable life. The only thing they could do was find a place where they could be helpful to others and do manual work. That was true all through world history. And as I said, today, anything that mom and dad want to do, they've got to get their work boots and their overalls on and go slug around in the mud trying to get these things together, while all the other responsibilities of family life and the household go undone. It's this constant trade-off of one activity for another, and it just doesn't work. And we've got to learn to simplify life and not try to do lots of different things, because there are no servants unless you're just going to spend $1 million to get workers to do things for you. So anyway, the problem of not having servants to do all the manual labor, so that dad could just sit around designing buildings and gardens and thinking of plans for things, and then deliver the plans over to the workers who spend all day working on it. These things just don't get done. Another major issue that modern American people don't think about has to do with education, and it relates to slavery as well. In ancient times, let's say ancient Greece for certain, children, or boys, I should say boys, were sent to school to study, and ancient Greek, I don't know how much you know about ancient Greek education, but basically from the time a boy was around 7 years old, sometimes even younger, he was sent to begin his formal training and education. The first phase, the primary phase of his education, lasted from around age 6 or 7, like our first grade, until he was 14 years old. And then when he was 14, he moved into his secondary education, which lasted from ages 14 to 18. And then at 18, he went into military service for 2 years, where he was trained for the military, spent 1 year in training, 1 year in the field, and then came back to civilian life to develop whatever his adult work was going to be. But when boys were sent to school, they were assigned, or there was assigned, one of the servants who occupied a position in the household that was called a pedagogue. And the pedagogue basically spent his entire life just watching the boys. He would lead them to school, watch over them when they were at school, make sure they were doing everything they were supposed to be doing while they were at school, make sure they weren't hanging around kids they shouldn't be hanging around with, making sure they were doing what their teachers were telling them to do, would walk them home, keep an eye on them at home, make sure they're doing everything at home they're supposed to do. They had servants dedicated to supervising the kids, like a full-time babysitter. But these were for boys, so it wasn't just like some teenage girl keeping an eye on the kids while mom and dad went out to dinner. It was a full-time worker whose job was to supervise and make sure that the boys were doing everything that their parents wanted them to do during the day. These pedagogues had the authority to whip the children. So they had authority to make the kids do what their parents do, and they followed the kids all day long. So again, when we go back in history and talk about these orderly societies and orderly households and respectful children, yeah, it was the work of a pedagogue to do that. It wasn't dad's job. Dad wasn't going to school to talk to the teachers and having parent-teacher conferences and trying to figure out where the kids were and making sure they were walking home. Mom wasn't chasing kids around during the day, trying to make sure that they were where they were supposed to be. That was the job of a pedagogue. And yet today, again, that whole office no longer exists unless I'm missing something. The kids go to school on a school bus, or they walk to school, if anybody even does that anymore. Or they're homeschooled, and while they're homeschooled, mom takes upon herself every responsibility. She's the servant, she's the mother, she's the wife, she's the pedagogue, she's the cook, she's the dishwasher, she's the nursing mother. Don't forget the children being born. And you've got this role in life that, again, in America, we've taken it for granted, like this is normal. But who did this in history? What woman did these things in history? I'd like you to give me some examples of women who did the kinds of things that, let's say, a homeschool mother is doing in modern America. And you've got different kinds of homeschool mothers. You've got homeschool mothers living out in the country. You've got homeschool mothers living in nice suburbs. So there's a big difference. You've got homeschool mothers living in cities. Very different lives they're living. But again, take any of them. Pick any one you want. Who in history can you name that did these things, that tried to pull off all of these different tasks, fulfill all of these different offices, and so on? And then you've got the fathers, and it's even it's even more crazy. The father is pressured to be the so-called spiritual leader of his home, which is great. He's also required to pay the bills in a cash-based, competitive, capitalistic society where there's just endless competition for every kind of work that exists, a constantly changing market, competing with foreign manufacturers, foreign businesses. Now you're dealing with increasing technology where more and more work is being automated. And this father who is sent into this competitive capitalistic society to earn a living is yelled at because he's not leading the family in prayer every day, and he's not doing this, and he doesn't have his kids in order because the kids are, left idle during the day and they're not disciplined because there's no pedagogue around. Again, I'd like you to tell me who in history did this job? Who in history successfully carried out the work of the modern American Catholic father? I'd like you to give me some examples. It's unprecedented. It really is unprecedented. Dad is also responsible for household maintenance. Any family activities need to be organized, planned, paid for, led, etc. Again, name a person in history who fulfilled these roles with no assistance, little or no assistance, as if all of these things are historically Dad's job. And you've got the same problem for both fathers and mothers, just wearing 20 different hats that in the past were worn by numbers of different people, with no support from the government system, no support from society. It's just unprecedented difficulties, unprecedented responsibilities. Now we can just, my wife and I sort of argue in a friendly way about this all the time. I'm not talking about any kind of serious argument, just discussing it back and forth, because we're different personality-wise and we have different views of these things. My wife's attitude is that we should always just keep at it, keep working harder, keep. And I criticize that because I tell her she's like a chicken, just always busy. But, are we actually accomplishing things? Are we actually achieving desired outcomes? Or are we just celebrating how busy we are? Are we just celebrating how hard we work? You get this attitude where the person's like, oh man, I'm just working my butt off today. Who cares? Like, if it's not intelligent work, if it's not well-planned, realistic work that actually accomplishes the desired outcomes, it's just foolishness. I used to joke and say, it's like going out into the backyard and plowing with my face. Like, I can come in at the end of the day with my nose worn off and huge open sores all over my face, exhausted, barely made it through one half of a row in 8 hours of trying to plow with my face. And man, I worked my butt off and tried so hard and I got nothing done and my face is destroyed. There's nobody who would look at that guy and say, wow, that's pretty virtuous work, That's what we need to do. We just need to work harder. We just need to do our best and try harder. No one would say that. And yet, for many Christian parents in America, that's what we're doing. It's like we're trying to hammer a nail, and we don't have a hammer, so we just use our face to hammer with. And then we get a pat on the back for being such a hard worker, being so committed because we chose to drive the nail with our forehead. It's just not intelligent. We're rational creatures. If there are desired outcomes, if we have responsibility to reach some objective or goal, And what we're doing is not going to reach that objective. Hard work is not a solution. It's like you have a business plan. And again, this is the kind of stuff my wife and I talk about. It's like having a business plan where in the business plan, it leads to a loss. You can do the math. You can see the Excel spreadsheet. And you can see that if we do all these things, in the end, we lose 25 cents. So what we're going to do in order to try to fix this is we're going to take this business plan and just work really, really hard at it. And that's what we're going to try to do to turn a profit. Well, the problem is you have a plan that doesn't profit, and it doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter how much you invest in this plan. The plan itself is unprofitable, and therefore hard work is not a virtue when you've got a plan that doesn't turn a profit, doesn't even break even. And this is how many American Christians are living their lives. They've got this business plan that can't work, that doesn't even suggest that the outcome will be positive. And they just imagine that by committing more and more effort to it, by investing more and more money in it, by working harder and harder and harder and sacrificing more and more, they'll win in the end. And the plan has no chance of winning, has no chance of bringing about the desired outcomes. And if you start to talk about changing the plan, and you see this is where the disagreements with my wife and I begin. When I suggest changing the plan, doing something differently, people act like you're trying to take away from them something that has been effective since the beginning of time. And the problem is this plan that's being followed has never been suggested by anyone or followed by anyone ever in history. And that's the crazy reality. It's that what's being so zealously committed to, so faithfully followed, is something that's completely unprecedented. And that's, to me, what makes absolutely no sense. When I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I remember parents would contact me and they would say, well, we're just learning about all this classical liberal arts stuff. We're learning about, this curriculum that you're promoting, but we're used to a more traditional kind of education. We're used to a more conventional, grade school education. There's almost no sense or awareness that grade school education that they're referring to as traditional was invented in the 1850s. And you just see how crazy this is. This idea that, we've got to be careful. We don't want to do anything crazy, and step out of this unbroken succession of wisdom and achievement that's continued all through history. We don't want to take risks. We don't want to be crazy. We don't want to do anything radical and use another program, because what we're doing is, the traditional way. And you can see that this historical ignorance makes people look at their way of life and imagine that this is the normal way, that this is the way people in the past did things. And for someone who studies history, I listen to these things and I'm amazed at how crazy one has to be to think that what you're doing is somehow normal historically. No one ever did this. No one ever sent their children, boys and girls, to a secular or secular-ish, because even the Christian schools they're sort of differently seasoned versions of the secular main course, if you know what I mean. No one ever did this. No one ever sent all of their children to a grade level school. No one ever had their kids at home and divided them into groups by age and taught them this K to 12 grade based math and science education. You're not doing something traditional. You're doing something that has never been done in history before the 1850s. And that's got to eventually sink in. It's important to note because I remember when I was studying, reading Cicero one time, I came across a quote. He said, and I just have to, I'm thinking of this on the spot, I just got to get the words straight. He said, to not know what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. To not know what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. Because as a child, you just have no idea what's going on. I mean, kids wake up and they think about breakfast. They wake up and they think about what they're going to do today, where they're going to play. You know, that's what kids think about when they live their day. They just live moment by moment. You know, as soon as you get done with one activity, they're asking about the next activity. They have no clue what's going on. They don't think about goals. They don't think about outcomes. They don't think about responsibilities coming down the road in their lives. They just think about the fact that there's a little bit of Hawaiian punch left in that container and I really want it. They don't think about the future or the past. They don't think about their place in history. They don't think about what's coming in the world and what they have to prepare for. They just live moment by moment. And I know some people will say that that's good, but that's not good. That's foolish. That's why they're made subject to parents who think about the past and the future. But Cicero said that to live and not know your place in history, to not know what happened before you were born, is to live a life where you continue in that state of childish ignorance for your whole life. To not know what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. And this, I think, is the problem among modern Christians. There are so few Christians who have studied history. They took math classes. They can talk about their high school algebra classes. They could talk about their chemistry class. Not that they learned algebra, not that they learned chemistry, because you don't have to actually master anything to get your diplomas and degrees. You don't have to worry because all the math grades are curved in college. There's no absolute mastery required. And so everyone goes through the system and comes out not even able to explain what they know or don't know. But they certainly didn't learn history. And because they didn't learn history, they have no way of thinking about life outside of the present. Now, I used to do this with my boarding school students when we had boys stay with us for boarding. I used to just talk to them about simple things like John Bosco, because they loved John Bosco. And I would say to them, John Bosco never walked into a room and flipped on a light switch. Never. John Bosco never walked into a room and flipped on a light switch because electricity in homes, electric lighting and so on, never existed. Never. St. Thomas Aquinas never sat down at a desk and flipped on a desk lamp. Never walked in and turned on a radio. Obviously never had a computer. I mean, even these things kids have a hard time imagining living without. You know, imagine a day when there was no Wi-Fi. It's getting harder and harder, you see this, for kids to even think about life before wireless internet access. But it goes way beyond this. It goes into things like household plumbing. People never walked in the house to go to the bathroom. People never woke up in the morning, walked across the hallway from their bedroom to the bathroom, and took a shower. And it's very difficult for us to imagine any other way of living than the way that the ordinary advertised culture in our society lives. And what's dangerous about that is you get yourself into these situations like I'm talking about, where you have desired outcomes in mind, and these outcomes, let's say they're historical outcomes. You're reading about the life of Saint Benedict, or you're reading a Bible story, or you're reading about some other saint, and you're thinking to yourself, this is what I want to achieve, this is what I want to do, I want to have this kind of life, I want to educate my children with this culture, and so on. And yet you're taking that outcome from a different place and time and period and trying to pursue it today, but you're also reading in that story, you're reading about the means by which that outcome was achieved, and you're thinking that you're going to go and obtain that outcome by similar means. And you're not, because those means took place in a completely different set of circumstances, and you don't have any of those other things. Or you think you're going to take those outcomes and pursue them through modern means, which aren't even intended to reach those outcomes, and you're simply not. And so you see there's a very complicated discussion that needs to be had, where we talk about the outcomes that we desire, first of all, and ask whether they're possible. And secondly, look at the outcomes and ask, by what means might we obtain these outcomes? Because it's not a matter of just working harder. It's not a matter of mom just staying up a little later, or dad just, cutting a few more hours out of his weekly sleep. And if we all just put in a little more effort, we'll have our outcomes. That's not true. The plans that we've got in place are not going to bring about the desired outcomes. And so when I look at these things, especially in my role as the head of a household, but also in my role as an academy headmaster, I look at the outcomes, and some of them I just say, that's not possible today. That outcome is not possible. In this generation, in these circumstances, that outcome is not possible. If you understand the historical circumstances and the means through which those outcomes were attained, you'll understand that those things simply don't exist today. They're not possible. We've got to adjust our desired outcomes to be realistic. And I'm not saying we should talk like a faithless wimp and say, we can't do anything. That's not what I'm saying. Obviously, I pursue high objectives and noble outcomes in my life, but I'm a realist at the same time. I know there are some things that I may admire in historical persons, but I know they're not possible today. And I don't seek them. I may seek, a degree of them, maybe, but I know that there are some things that are simply not possible, and I don't torment myself by seeking them. I consider what a better desired outcome might be, one that's more realistic. So we've got to think about the outcomes, and as a father and a husband and as a business owner, as an academy headmaster, I've got to ask whether outcomes are realistic or whether we should be aiming at different outcomes because of our different circumstances, which is a very complicated topic to get into. I know if I talked about that, people would go nuts. But then we've also got to talk about the means. We've got to talk about the means by which we're going to pursue these outcomes. You've got people who say, we want our kids to have a traditional, let's say, scholastic Catholic education. Well, there are no armies of schoolmasters to teach these subjects. And if we're honest, you're going to find that your family doesn't have enough money to pay for these things, that you're talking about education that was received by extraordinarily wealthy people who were not living in capitalistic societies. And you're saying let's just send the 14-year-old to university because we read that that's what St. Dominic. Well, you're talking about a completely different culture. The culture was arranged differently. The government was different. The whole society was different. What they meant by university was different. You can't do that. You can't think naively like that and historically ignorantly like that. You can't do that. So we've got to ask, we've got to really get down to goals and principles, and we've got to come up with creative means. We've got to come up with creative means by which we pursue these things. And this is something that modern Christians are just terrible at. They're good at acting like Amish people. Modern Christians are good at basically pretending to be Christians from different generations. They're good at that. You can listen to men on YouTube who call themselves Catholic apologists, and you'll find that they're arguing issues that were contemporary in the 1500s. They would be amazing 16th century Catholics. But then you turn to the issues of our generation, the controversial issues that are tearing apart families and pulling apart the church and so on, and they're ignorant because their minds are so wrapped up in these anachronistic controversies, and they don't have a knowledge of principles to apply to new questions, new problems in creative ways. They're not actually problem solvers. They're just men who study solutions that other people came up with for historical problems. It's the same problem we see in modern math classes, where they'll take these fake, overly simplified school problems. The teacher will say, okay, kids, here's how you solve this problem. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. Step 3, do this. Go ahead, solve the problem and show your work. Well, that's not problem solving. That's not problem solving. That's just following procedures for problems that have already been solved. When those kids, trained like that to simply follow procedures, encounter an unfamiliar problem, they're useless. They're useless. They don't know the principles, and therefore, because they don't know the principles, they can't find solutions creatively. They're just stuck trying to figure out which set of procedures is supposed to be used, and it's because they haven't been given a mathematical education. They've been given an education in the history of solutions, the history of calculations, but not in the calculations that need to be done to solve new problems. And the same thing is true in the Christian life. We've got most men are studying to be great Christians in different places at different times, but they're not studying to be great in their own place, in their own time. And so they're great. You want to talk about what's wrong with Martin Luther's argument? Oh man, you'll find guys who are eloquent. They can just let it rip. But get into a modern issue. Talk about modern science and modern scientific theories. Get into things like artificial intelligence. Get into things like medical care, medical ethics, and things like that in 21st century society. And you'll find they're like kids looking at a math problem they never saw before. They'll say, the teacher, you never showed us this. Because their education is almost an education for a different generation, and it's not real education. So for us, living in this culture, until we come to grips with the reality that the circumstances are all different, the disadvantages, as far as using ordinary means is concerned, are insurmountable. We're never going to overcome the disadvantages as long as we cling to ordinary means. The outcomes are simply not going to be obtained. The problems are not going to be solved. If you're a head of a household listening to this, you've got to do jobs, and you're supposed to handle responsibilities that men handled with the assistance of servants who took care of all different works. Your wife would not be doing the stuff she's doing. Your wife would have servants helping her with her household tasks. You can't just go about life as if you're going to achieve some timeless human outcomes in very different circumstances by any ordinary means. You're going to have to figure out how to accomplish these desired outcomes in your circumstances. And those discussions, men just don't have those discussions. When I want to think about those kinds of things, I spend time alone. I don't even know any men who have those discussions. And I find that if I do talk about these things, men either want to just act like Amish people and pretend they're just going to live as if, it's Charles Ingalls. They're just going to live as if it's life on the prairie, and they're just going to pretend that they live on set for Little House on the Prairie episodes, and almost block out the world and just live in denial of their historical circumstances. Or they just make excuses and they just say, I can't do it, it's impossible, don't even bother, just send your kid to the public school, that's all you can do. It's one of these opposite extremes. And the actual problem solving is not even undertaken. Those discussions are simply not had by men. And the same thing's true of women. Women are either trying to look like Mrs. Ingalls and pretend that they're either a Mennonite housewife living on the self-sufficient farm, or they're just modern suburban ladies, drop the kids off at all their activities and just do what all the other ladies are doing. And yet both of them will be talking about raising saints and all this kind of stuff, ignoring all of the challenges of our generation. And this is what's wrong. This is why if you feel like, I'm trying to raise my kids, I'm trying to raise them to be Catholics, I'm trying to raise them to be morally upright, I'm trying to raise them to love beautiful culture, I'm trying to raise them to seek wisdom, I'm trying to learn them, I'm trying to raise them to desire to marry a respectable partner, who, for my daughters to marry a man who might actually be able to provide for them, rather than like the first bum that they meet on Snapchat. And I just feel like for every step forward, there's 100 steps backward. I feel like for every effort of mine that I make, there are 1,000 forces working against me to undermine everything I do. Some of those forces even feel like they come from other Christians. And I think I'm going crazy. And I start to think that something must be wrong with me. I just want you to take time. I want you to take time to think about your historical circumstances and how unprecedented they are, and whether what you're trying to do, whether your desired outcomes are what they should be. Because if your desired outcomes are not what they should be, you're going to live a life of endless vexation. And if your desired outcomes are what they should be, then you need to examine whether the means by which you're seeking them are what they should be. Because if you're trying to seek some timeless outcome in different circumstances by old means, it's not going to work. And the problem is, in your circumstances, your unique circumstances, you may have to invent the means to achieve your desired outcomes. That's what problem solving is. You may have to invent the means. You may have to come up with a method or a plan that no one has thought of before because your circumstances are different. And it may be a very complicated set of plans. But if you don't do that, you're going to fall into the situation that, people say Einstein said. I don't know that Einstein ever said this. A lot of these quotes are just falsely attributed. But when there's a quote that says, if you continue to do the same thing and expect different outcomes, it's a sign that you're crazy, right? To paraphrase it. If you're just going to continue down this path that has no promise of success, and your only response is going to be to try to work harder and do it more, you're just acting unreasonably. If you've got a bad plan, working harder and harder on that plan is not going to bring about success. It would be better for you to consider whether the plan might be changed. There may be some outcomes, some desired outcomes you have to let go of, and just realize you're not going to have that. Of course, you can have these things by God's grace. Sometimes things work out in completely unpredictable ways. But there are different priorities among desired outcomes. And if you can't have them all, you've got to pick which ones are the priorities. And this is why I said before, if I talk about these topics, people tend to go nuts. I keep them to myself. I tend to believe that in this generation, it's actually imprudent to try to raise devoutly religious Catholic kids. I believe that as a desired outcome, that's not realistic. Of course, it can happen again by grace, but I don't believe, humanly speaking, it's prudent to try to aim that high given the circumstances. I think it's better. I think we should seek sort of an intermediate goal where we seek to raise kids who are strong in what are called the classical virtues and simply prepare young adults who are well disposed to the Catholic faith. Because I don't think that, I know that in most places, the circumstances do not allow for parents to raise kids like Thomas Aquinas or Aloysius Gonzaga. The circumstances are not in place. There are so many things that are different. For example, the church is not in political power. We don't live under Christian kings. The religious men and women don't perform the kinds of works for the community that they used to perform. Parents just don't have the help that they need in religious formation. I don't think the outcomes can be what they used to be. And so what happens is I think many parents imprudently make this like raising saints or bust plan for their family life, and 99% of them are going to bust because it's just not realistic. There are too many obstacles. I think we see the church wisely, the hierarchy of the church wisely leads us in the right way, telling us that we can't expect outcomes from the past by ordinary means. But you see how Christians revolt against that, and they call the church unfaithful for acknowledging the truth of our circumstances. These are controversial issues. Thankfully, I don't have to persuade everyone of them to pursue them in my own life. But that's the kind of thing that we've got to think about. And so if you're living as a Catholic parent and you just feel like no matter how hard I work, I'm just always barely able to keep my mouth and nose above the level of rising water. And it doesn't matter because there's 1 million people pumping water into this room I'm in, and it's just getting deeper and deeper, and I'm paddling and paddling and paddling and barely surviving. And it seems like my kids would be content to just swim to the bottom and not even try to survive. They don't even understand what's going on. If you feel that drowning feeling as a parent, I don't think it's because there's something wrong with you. I don't think it's something that parents are failing to do. I think most of us parents are doing far more than parents did in past generations, but our circumstances are so significantly different that to expect similar outcomes is just tormenting us. And we've got to have discussions about what the proper outcomes should be that we desire. And then we should discuss by what creative, innovative, practicable means we can actually pursue them. Because if we don't do this, we're just either continuing with plans that don't work, and we already know that, or we're just setting imprudent goals. And that sense of frustration caused by imprudent goals is called vexation or perturbation philosophically, and it's a sign of foolishness. So we've got to address this, and very few people talk about it. Outside of my discussions with my wife, I hardly talk about these things with anybody. And my wife and I are like 20 years along in these discussions, but I think that there's a lot of stuff to be discussed, and if you're interested in discussing it, then I'd be happy to welcome you into the little circle where we discuss these things. But anyway, don't get discouraged. Don't think that you're not working hard enough or not investing enough or not sacrificing. I don't think that's the problem. I think that we've got to look at our goals and whether they're realistic in our circumstances, and we've got to consider extraordinary, and by extraordinary I don't mean increased, I mean different means of pursuing these ends. Those of you who are struggling in the way that I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And I'll leave it at that. If you've listened to this and have no idea what I'm talking about, just pass on by. God bless.